Hi everyone, thanks so much for being here, and thanks so much to Gavin for the initial invitation. Earlier this month I organised 2 small conferences at the University of Copenhagen where I'm based, so I know how much effort goes into organising these even smaller events and pre-conferences and so on. So thanks so much for all those who are involved. I really appreciate it. It's really wonderful. I had a very nice time this morning as well, listening to lots of different people, of course, giving presentations in different styles, using different methods and different interpretations of this idea of social psychology as future or of the future and so on. As Gavin has alluded to, some colleagues and I wrote a paper that was published earlier this year in Personality and Social Psych Review, entitled Social Psychology of and for World Making. So I guess this is one that maybe got some attention and maybe linked into how some people are thinking about social psychology, maybe looking at some of the limitations of the paradigm and where we might go in the future. So in the first half of my talk, I'm going to talk a little bit around this paper and some of the issues my collaborators and co-writers on the paper discussed. And then in the second half of the presentation, I'm going to give 3 empirical examples from my own work that I've been developing over the last decade or so, 3 case studies with an emphasis on an Irish case study on economic inequality. I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change and protests in Norway against an action towards climate change. And then finally, some recent research from COVID with my colleagues at the University of Copenhagen, like acts of world making, reopening Danish society following these lockdowns. So the theme will be world making throughout. I'm going to make a lot of methodological points as well. Generally, I'm a field researcher, so I'm going to say something about field social psychology. I'm an ethnographer, I will say. I like to go out into different places, into crowds, meet different people. So I'm really kind of advocate for ecological validity and studying unfolding phenomena over time as a way of understanding how people are making the world and how we as social psychologists can contribute to the making of these worlds. So that's what's to come, maybe in the next 40 or so minutes. But before that, I want to kind of set the scene of, when we're generating these ideas for the social psychology as world-making paper, what was kind of the landscape in psychology? And of course, this big issue of the replication crisis that I'm sure we're all familiar with really grabbed a lot of headlines in 2015. And I thought that was of interest, and of course I followed the various debates, both in academic literature and on Twitter and in more informal spaces as well. And for me, of course, and for many people, it exposed the limitations of the current predominant model in social psychology, this experimental paradigm. But what I thought was kind of more interesting as this kind of debate about the replication crisis unfolded and developed, a lot of really good people were trying to solve it in various ways. But my observation was they were trying to solve this problem with the paradigm in social psychology by within paradigm solutions. So more open science, better sharing of knowledge, more transparency, more sophisticated statistical techniques, and so on. So even when we had this kind of opportunity in social psychology to rethink what was happening, the dominant responses and the quick responses were within paradigm solutions. And I thought this was, at least for me, something that was frustrating and showed the limitations of these mainstream approaches in social psychology. And coupled with this, some years previous to the replication crisis, we had the weird paper, I know Gavin spoke about it this morning, the Western Educated Industrial Rich and Democratic Problem by Heinrich and his collaborators, that showed that we have this over-reliance on an atypical slice of humanity when it comes to thinking and theorizing in social psychology. I should say, I know I'm talking today about social psychology, I primarily identify as a cultural psychologist, which obviously overlaps a lot with social psychology. But the weird problem was something that was kind of particularly on my mind for quite some time as well. Particularly this idea of the separation of researcher from the types of people who are being researched. You get this kind of divorce from cultural and social context that, as a social and cultural psychologist, I found very problematic. And again, it exposed this kind of further limitations with the dominant experimental paradigm in social psychology. So these are 2 of the kind of more predominant crises in the last decade or so in social psychology. But really, since the origin of psychology, there have been all sorts of debates along these types of lines as well. And people have responded to the limitations of social psychology in various ways. I'm sure some of you might be familiar with this very famous essay by Ken Gergen, Social Psychology as History, that got an enormous amount of attention, both at the time and then in the subsequent decades. Somewhat recently, maybe 2 years ago, Daniel Sullivan at Arizona University wrote a kind of a 50-year anniversary piece in Personality and Social Psych Review, kind of revisiting some of Gergen's claims 50 years later and trying to reinvigorate this idea of a critical historical approach, as social psychology can be best conceptualized not as a search for universal laws, but rather we can look at synthesizing concepts and social psychology as history with the importance of cultural context being part of this. So in this context, my collaborators and I, we met in Neuchâtel in Switzerland in the summer in 2019 to kind of have a talk about the current state of social psychology. We talked about these issues with Gergen and Sullivan and some of these problems with replication and some of these problems with the weird issue. And we started thinking about the push and the pull of social psychology. And we had this idea that the critical historical approach outlined by Gergen and Daniel Sullivan and many other very fine people over the decades working on this is concerned with how the past pushes people into the future. So this idea of the importance of collective memory, of collective histories and the narratives of the past, pushing human thought, feeling and action as it drives our behaviour forward into the future. And this, of course, is a very important way to understand human psychology and social psychology, that we're temporal, developmental beings being pushed by the past, by history, by memories, and so on. Gavin made note of Vlad Glanvaux earlier, one of our colleagues in sociocultural psychology, now working in Dublin actually. But he makes this very fine point that humans are not only embedded in the past, that they live on a psychological level in many potential futures. And I think this is a really key transformative point from Vlad. So the idea that, we talked a little earlier, one of the online presentations, we spoke about this kind of presentism versus kind of forward thinking people, and this demarcation of people into two different groups. But the point from Vlad kind of juxtaposes this a little bit, and it's congruent with the question that was asked by the person at the back of the room here today. Are people simultaneously both in the past and the present and in the future? And this is the point made by Vlad, that we are at a psychological level living in many different pasts and many different futures, as much as we are here embodied in the physical present. So this has made us think a little bit more about social psychology and this idea of a world-making approach that advocates for research on how human imaginings pull people into the future. So we're not just being pushed by the weight of history and the weight of the past. Actually, our imaginings of what the world could be like or what it should be like are really motivating for us. They're really pulling us into the future. And this is one of the key kind of points in the genesis of this kind of project on social psychology of and for world making. And these are just some books, recent books in sociocultural psychology that we drew a lot of influence from. Particularly, there was a quote from one of the presentations earlier from Tanya Zlatan, Alex Gillespie. This book on imagination and human development, human and cultural development, is a really amazing volume. Of course, developed by Zlatan, Vlad, Sandra Obradovic, Collective Memories of Brady Wagner, and Sarah Awad as well in Albo University. Really trying to bring this project of socio-cultural psychology, of imagination forward and into the future. And the main kind of theoretical idea underlying this is this looping metaphor. This idea that we're all physically here in the present and in our bodies now, but people decouple very often from the here and now, that we get away from our immediate experience and project into the future, whether this is on an individual level, group level, national, or even a global level. So the idea of imagining itself is not real, but the content and consequences of imagining are very real. So people decouple, they project into the future what the world could be like, what it should be like, and then loop back into the present, informed by the content and manifestations of this imagining, and it changes us, motivates us, and pulls us into the future. So some of these books are really key, but if I was to nominate one, I would go for this kind of theoretically dense one from Zutton and Gillespie that really sets a really nice agenda. So all of this led to the publication, as Gavin alluded to this paper very recently on social psychology of and for world making, which was a really nice collaborative project that I was very honoured and happy to lead. And what we did was we set down this new agenda for a new paradigm in social psychology with 4 propositions. In terms of philosophy of science, in terms of ontologies, we make the point that the world is always unfolding, that the world is always developing. In terms of the production of knowledge, epistemology, that social psychologists can use theoretical imagination to anticipate and also participate in world making. And I think this is the kind of key point, and the key point of change for social psychology as well. The fact that we're not just merely describing the world, but we're also active in its creation. This idea that we're participating in the formation of knowledge and thus the formation of the worlds in which we live. And when we're thinking about these ideas when it comes to knowledge creation and our participation as social psychologists impacting the world, of course, naturally this brings up issues to do with ethics. And I don't mean ethics as in IRB and informed consent in this view of ethics, but researchers are embedded in these developing contexts and have a responsibility to consider the consequences of their knowledge for world making. And I think this is really, really important. What we do matters. It's not just, some academic paper that we publish and maybe no one reads, or a talk that we give and it doesn't impact. Really what we do individually and collectively really impacts the world, and we should really think carefully about the consequences of our own research. And as I said, I'm a cultural psychologist. Sometimes, depending on the crowd, I introduce myself as a political psychologist, and you'll see the types of work in the second part of my talk that I do. At least for me, this is probably the thing I take most seriously, is the potential consequences of these world-making activities. And I also I want to say some things about methods as well. Basically, I think in social psychology, as we demonstrated this morning, and I'm sure later this afternoon, that we have the methods in social psychology to study developing worlds and to inform the world-making of the world in which we live. So we distinguish between 2 types of world making, and this is something I think some of us chatted a little bit about at lunch, but I think it's kind of a key distinction. We can study people making worlds, and I think a lot of us kind of do this in our research. People are interested in collective action. I'll give 2 types of collective action research in Ireland and in Norway after the break. So I think this is something that we can kind of do, the questions we ask. We often study people who are making worlds. But maybe a little bit more of an understated point, and one of the kind of novelties of this approach, is that social psychology itself is contributing to world making. Again, what we do contributes to the world, and also what we do not do. And the questions we don't ask, and the answers we do not provide, also contribute by their absence to world making, and perhaps, you might argue, worse world making. Social psychology can become more useful and relevant for understanding change and possibility. And this is something I think also key. It's not about, and the way at least the way I think about these types of papers and publishing these types of agenda papers as well, that I don't want to be unfair to other social psychologists and other people in these realms that have a different way of doing their research, or if they're using statistical methods or experimental methods or whatever it might be. I don't want to denigrate anyone's research. I think a lot of people are working for the good from their own paradigms and so on. So the kind of the way we frame the paper and the way I generally think about it is that we can also study change and also study possibility on top of what's already been done. And I think this can be a nice move, and at least for kind of shifting this kind of big shift of social psychology, rather than kind of waving the fist and saying, oh, all those people are wrong, and I've got the right way. So this is one paradigm amongst many. And I think for me, this is how I like to frame it. And I think it's maybe a generous way of framing it. So I want to say a little bit about the 4 propositions that we talk about in the paper. Of course, as I've mentioned, ontologies conceptualize a composition of the world, being investigated from a philosophy of science point of view. And one of the really big debates in the philosophy of science and social sciences can be boiled down to this idea of things or processes. Do we conceptualize the world as being comprised of things or elements that move about somehow, and that our job as psychologists is to kind of use experiments and study these elements and how they move about in some way? Or is the world genuinely developmental? Is newness and novelty being created? And can we have, and do we have the means and capabilities of studying these processes? So this idea of emergent processes is one of these kind of fundamental ideas and one of the fundamental key points of the paper that we're advocating for this kind of process ontology rather than static ontology. I think the world and our jobs as social psychologists would be a lot easier. The world is filled of things, and then we can bit by bit figure out how things work. Like maybe physicists figure out how the universe works in this kind of world of quanta. But in our world of qualia, the world of subjectivities and meaning making and experiences and so on, we have a lot of complexity, we have a lot of processes that are interlocking, and us as researchers, of course, are embedded within this as well. When it comes to epistemology, it's a study of how knowledge is produced and justified. We're not simply describing the world, we contribute to its creation. And we can contribute this through knowledge, through interaction, dialogical interaction, and through our own imaginations. And this guides people's actions and the social realities they create. So again, to hammer home this point that what we do, the knowledge we create, really impacts the world. And we need to take responsibility for it. It has ethical consequences. It highlights human reflexivity and sensitivity. This idea from an ontological position, if we're embedded within the social world in which we live, that we have to be reflexive about how and why we're producing knowledge, and we have to be sensitive to its consequences. We have to highlight our own positionality and the plurality of different views when it comes to making the world, this idea of world making. Lots of different people will have different visions of how the world could be and how it should be. And an awareness of the consequences of one's own actions. So it moves beyond informed consent, IRB, as I've already mentioned. We can ask more serious questions from an ethical point of view. Who is impacted by the knowledge that we do and do not create? Who has the power in the relationship in the production of knowledge? Is it the researcher? Is it the participants in some way? What communities are empowered and which might be disempowered or non-empowered by the research? And is knowledge to enable participant action or to further an academic career? I'm going to give a shout out to my collaborator, Alex Gillespie, at the London School of Economics, who wrote this last question in the last paper that he published before being promoted to full professor. So I was like, give Alex the nod on that. And this moves us on a little bit to world-making methods. And I'm really impressed by Gavin's opening speech and the types of presentations that we heard this morning. Those kind of mixes of qualitative and quantitative, lots of different interpretations, kind of more liberal, artistic views on methods. And I think this is really what we do, we ought to do in social psychology, is have a pure plurality of different methods, interlocking methods, and creativity in the methods that we use, whether it is a form of quantification or people are just using qualitative ethnographic methods. I think they're totally legitimate, and mixing and matching is totally legitimate as well. So over the last number of years, some collaborators and I, particularly my friend Gabe Velez, who's an American Colombian cultural developmental psychologist at Marquette University, we've been developing a number of models. This one on top, the SAGE model of social psychological research, published in Perspectives on Psychological Science, where we can make these arguments for the importance of using qualitative and quantitative procedures together, overcoming some of the ontological, perhaps impasses, and on a practical level, how different forms of knowledge can be used in conjunction. You know, maybe some of you are getting to the stage in your career where you're writing grants and so on. I think this paper has gotten me some really, really big grants. I think, you know, providers and funders really like to see this kind of qual-quant mixed methods type of approach, and any kind of success I've had in money in the last 5 or so years has really been based on the SAGE paper. The MOVE framework, again with Gabe Velez, we're trying to develop this methodology for how how to study unfolding socio-political processes, so the MOVE, the acronym being meanings, observations, viewpoints, and experiences of social change. We write about how young people in Colombia were understanding the peace process as it unfolded from 2017 in that country. But what I want to focus a little more on today is the last paper, Field Social Psychology, published in American Psychologist late last year. And this is the kind of real methodological approach that I've taken, and it's going to frame the three empirical examples I'm going to turn to after this. So field social psychology as a method and a general approach to world making, what is it? We describe field social psychology as a conceptual and methodological approach to describe, examine, and explain psychological phenomena at multiple levels of analysis, with emphasis on socio-cultural environments in which people are embedded, the unfolding of psychological processes over time, and the use of ecological valid multiple methods in conjunction. And I know it's a rather lofty definition, but this is really what I strive to do when I undertake new research projects. This idea of using quant methodologies together in an ecologically valid way, and also kind of having the bravery sometimes to kind of chart unfolding socio-political phenomena. And I think that can be something that's quite difficult to do, and I'll talk through it in one of the examples I'll give after this. But when it comes to studying social movements, sometimes there's an unpredictability to when they originate, how they're going to develop or not. So it's really kind of hard to hang your hat on, I'm going to write this project on a social movement, maybe it dissipates, maybe the police crack down, maybe it gains some traction and so on. But I do think this idea of crowds and crowd psychology is one of the key ways that people and psychologists can generate social change and impact world making. So why do we need these kind of field methods when it comes to world making? So as I've mentioned, there's many limitations within the predominant model in social psychology. We need to refocus social and cultural psychology on experiences and meanings, engage with cultural similarities and cultural differences, and engage with processes as they develop over time. And why, you might ask, is any of this important? And my answer, I guess, is to comprehend and orientate to, and also to help alleviate the global challenges that all of us here, in one way or the other, are concerned with. Examples such as economic and social inequalities, climate change, and the impact of COVID-19 on our lives. So now I'm going to switch and talk a little bit about these three different case studies that I've been doing over the last decade or so. So the first is concerned with the economic crisis in Europe and the United States, precipitated by the collapse of the Lehman Brothers in 2007, 2008 in the United States, and the subsequent recovery of a lot of countries from 2016. So my general overarching research question and the topic of the book that I'm writing at the moment is, what are people's psychological reactions to economic hardships? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the psychology of fairness, which I think underlies a lot of issues to do with world making. When people talk about wanting a better world or to change the world, really they're talking about moral psychology and moral principles, and often this can boil down to perceptions of fairness. I'm going to briefly talk about two qualitative studies with a group of elites and unemployed people in Ireland. I'm going to say a few words about world making and the type of output that I was producing at the time, and talk about contextual shift in Ireland and the introduction of a new tax on water. I'm going to talk then very briefly about studies and ethnographic fieldwork during protests in the Republic of Ireland. So in terms of the psychology of fairness, I think, I came to Copenhagen. I'm here about 4 or 5 years at the University of Copenhagen. Before that, I spent 7 years at the University of Chicago in the United States. In America, people talk about morality all the time, in psychology, in anthropology, in philosophy, and law. And you come back to the European context, and there's very little that's been done in terms of morality. But here, we get a lot on imagination, and sociocultural approaches, and so on. But anyway, this idea of mixing morality tends to be something I like to do, and theorizing on morality is something I find to be important. This idea of fairness seems to be a universal moral principle. It's fundamental both to humans and non-human species. It begins in early childhood in humans, that people think economic disparities are particularly unfair, and even kids have a sense of proportionality and fairness when it comes to economic resources that are salient and important to them. So we get this kind of evolutionary, ingrained, culturally widespread view that perception of fairness tends to be important when it comes to the balance of the world, what people think are just and unjust in some way. But when it came to the Irish case study, when I started my PhD in 2012, I had this observation that the economy had collapsed in Ireland, like many other places in the European Union. The background photo here is from Greece, where the Greeks were protesting against the government and the banks. Similar situations in Portugal and in Spain and in Italy. But in Ireland, we had this much more muted response. The economy collapsed, there was lots of hardship, and people were passively accepting this. And basically, as a qualitative person, an ethnographic person, I wanted to find out what was going on. So I spoke to a group of elites in Ireland, people who were very well known in the public sphere, who were talking about the causes, consequences, and solutions to the economic recession. So I thought, I didn't know anything about economics, but these kind of people who are always on TV analysing it and talking about it, they might be a good starting point. So they came up with these, I came up with these thematic analysis based on interview data with 20 of these very influential, very ultra weird people, middle-aged, wealthy white men, more or less, in Ireland. So they told me about migration from Ireland, they told me about this idea of social cohesion being important, and the idea I want to highlight is this provocative idea that in life you get what you deserve, in life you reap what you sow. And these are the three reasons given to me by this group of elites to explain why Irish people were accepting austerity, accepting the problems in Ireland. So the idea is that they were to blame, and therefore if you were to blame, you don't go on the streets protesting against the government because you feel culpable. So this is, came up with one of the presentations earlier today, and I asked about blame and the distribution of blame with this in mind. So here's just one small piece of qualitative data from this very influential economist who's on TV all the time. He tells me, I don't think any one participant can cause what happened in this country without the implicit approval of the people in it and the tacit approval of the people of those who weren't in it. So when people say, well, I was never part of it, well, if you were here, you were getting impressive wage rises, you were taking the benefit of it, you were just not playing the game at the table. So in some sense this is a little bit mundane and maybe a little bit confusing, but basically what he's saying here is that regular people were to blame for the economic recession in Ireland, and this is why they're not protesting or taking to the streets in some way. The idea is that, okay, maybe you're not like being super corrupt and getting these massive wage rises and so on, but actually if you're just here, you're part of the system, and then the system collapses, therefore you're culpable too. So of course you get a lot of criticism for this type of paper, an ultra weird group, very wealthy people blaming regular people for, you can imagine how this was and how presenting it was and so on. So it motivated a second study with a kind of polar opposite group of people, young, unemployed people in Ireland. I interviewed a comparative sample of these people as well. And what I found was really interesting and really common across all this interview data was this internalization of this reap what you sow principle, that in life you should get what you deserve. So again, just a quick illustrated example from a young guy who was unemployed, trained as a carpenter, very sweet, very charming guy. I took him out for a coffee and we did our interview. And I say, who, if anyone, do you blame for the recession? You have to blame society in general, you know what I mean? So who do you mean by society, I ask? The Irish public. It's not just the Irish, I guess it's a world recession. But I think we were so naive to think that we will just enjoy these moments without any plan for the future. My mother and father spent what they wanted. They got loans out and would spend it and worry about it in the future. And this last part about his mum and dad, he tells me these kind of really sad stories that they're going through a divorce or in all these financial difficulties. But the idea here is that he's not angry with the government, with the central bank, with the European Central Bank, Angela Merkel or the Germans or whatever it might be. He's really talking about like regular Irish people in the public. He said, yeah, it's a world recession, but it's people like my mum and dad, and they did this type of thing. And it's really psychologically quite interesting that people have this kind of self-blame narrative in the Irish in the Irish context. So I see it as a form of kind of, maybe you talk about it as system justification or world maintenance rather than world remaking in some way. But I thought these kind of pilot studies were quite interesting. I wrote an op-ed in the Guardian newspaper with a friend of mine, Dave Nussbaum, reporting these findings, kind of playing in this kind of fighting Irish kind of stereotype. The fighting Irish, not when it comes to recession and austerity. I spoke about it on multiple radio shows across the UK, including this kind of famous one in Ireland called The Business that goes out to hundreds of thousands of people. And I basically presented what I just presented to you. But I thought this was kind of interesting early in my career to kind of shine back some of these results, not just in an academic paper that came out sometime later in some book chapters, but also into the media and to be a bit public about some of these findings. And it definitely struck a chord in a way that I was really not expecting in any way at all. And I think, you know, I mean, it's hard to disentangle any impact that these kind of studies and this kind of public exposure would have had. But at the same time, there was a kind of a strong shift in the narrative in Ireland. So here is a photograph of our former Taoiseach or Prime Minister, Enda Kenny, on the front of Time magazine, basically saying, you know, Ireland was sick, we took our medicine, now we're better, or we went to a party, we were hungover, and now we're recovered again. Basically, there was this Irish Celtic comeback, please invest in Ireland, and so on. So all the GDP figures, all the economic indices were showing this kind of real improvement in Ireland, and there's this kind of buoyant narrative in Ireland at the time. But this wasn't all that was happening. In this context, the government introduced a new tax on water that disproportionately impacted regular people. So traditionally in Ireland, and as it is now, water is paid through general taxation. There's no special tax on it. So in the context of people having endured and suffered austerity with the hope that things would get better, when things finally started getting better, they hit them with a new tax. And this is what really mattered to people. They took to the streets, it was the final straw, and you had this massive explosion of collective action and collective protest over a year in Ireland. So I needed to develop a dynamic methodology. I hadn't been to, as an ethnographer, to any protests at that time before, but I went to the streets. If anyone's been to O'Connell Street in Dublin city centre, 100,000 people on the main boulevard. I went with my little tape recorder and notebook up to people, and I started interviewing people and asking why they were there, what they hoped to achieve, and so on. So I interviewed hundreds of people as part of this project. There was also splinter groups and splinter protest groups that are a little bit more mischievous, a bit more dubious in their tactics in protesting, and I did more in-depth ethnographic work with these people over the course of the year as well. And they talked a lot about unfairness and this idea of this moral violation of their sense of fairness, really galvanizing collective action, collective protest, and really wanting them to forcing them in some sense to protest, to take to the streets, to vote out the government and make a more just utopian world in Ireland. So this one woman I spoke to, this is just one example. She says there's far too much austerity on ordinary people, on ordinary working class people, and even middle income people are being crucified with high taxation, with motor tax, petrol tax, value added tax, everything. Everything you buy in this country, it's far too dear, it's far too expensive. I performed a content analysis on these hundreds of interviews. People, of course, were upset at the charge on water, the cost of living, homeless crisis, government not representing the people, problems with the health service, the perception that the police were on the side of corporations and not the public. And there's a shift in attribution of blame when it comes to reap what you sow. So it wasn't people turning this reap what you sow Irish logic into them, that they were to blame. In fact, it was now the government who should reap what they sow. We gave you a fair chance to get us out of this mess, and now you put this new tax on us in this context. We're going to vote you out, we're going to protest, and this is exactly what happened. The tax was abolished, the government was voted out. One left-wing politician, one of the final protests, summed it up very nicely. She says, "Let no one be in any doubt that our demand will be an end to water charges and to Irish water and the beginning of a society based on equality, decency and fairness. And full citizenship for every single one of us, that means a roof over every citizen's head, and means decent work, decent chance, and fair taxation. So we can theorize a lot from this type of local knowledge, that people can tolerate economic hardship even during a recession when it's considered fair. And this might seem like a very provocative point if we really think about it, right? Depending on your political orientation, how you interpret and make actionable this point. Economic hardship is deemed unfair even during growth, and social movements can develop. And it's really the key psychological point here is that perceptions of what is and is not fair modulate whether people tolerate growing economic inequalities or not. And these points are important, allows us to comprehend these kind of unfolding socio-political phenomena, and we can use it to understand similar global events as well. We can understand the Occupy Wall Street movement, for example, that occurred in 2011 when the economy was recovering from the 2007 collapse, but it was clear that the rich were getting richer, leaving regular people behind. In Chile in 2019 too, when the government, in the context of a booming economy, introduced a new, increased the charge on subways that disproportionately affected workers and young people and students. Sudan, where the government, in terms of a growing economy as well, introduced increased tax on fuel and bread. The yellow vests, exactly the same kind of scenario where the government increased the tax on fuel. It can be explained, of course, by this idea of relative deprivation. It's really a foundational theory from sociology, Sam Stuffler, when it comes to individuals or groups comparing themselves to salient other individuals or groups. If you think that they're lacking in some way or discriminated against, this leads to angry frustration. With my PhD student, Thomas Masson, and my colleague, Thomas Morton, who some of you might know, they're both here in the conference somewhere, we wrote a little theory paper expanding this idea of who compares who to who. We talk about the idea of technology altering our subjective experiences. We critically question who are the 1%. And we talk about time, this idea of past, present, and future comparisons, which leads nicely onto a second case study that I wanted us to say a few words about. This Fridays for Future youth protest that happened in Norway, where young people, high school students, were taken to the streets protesting against inaction against climate change. So this was done with two former MA students who are now PhD students at the University of Oslo, and Jonas Kunst, a colleague of mine from the University of Oslo, who's also around at the conference somewhere for the next coming days. We framed it, I think, in a kind of a nice, perhaps provocative way when it comes to young people and climate in Norway, around what we call the Norwegian paradox. And Norway, of course, especially with young people, are strong environmental ambitions to meet the terms of the Paris Agreement. But yet, on the other hand, this is in contrast with the privileged position the oil economy has granted this young generation. And then the research question became, how do we understand the motivations for young people to protest in action against climate change? So this was published in Journal of Environmental Psychology. Someone spoke at the lunch about, is it better to separate qual-quant research? This one is a nice combination of qual-quant, but the word count was terrible. So I'll present some of the ethnographic work just very briefly. We interviewed nearly 100 young people, did a lot of participant observation, and the analysis showed, how young people negotiate responsibility for climate change. They do not blame themselves, they distribute the blame to many people. This idea of a shared identity that motivates protest, and this idea of imagined deprivation. I want to give you one example of what a young person on the streets told one of the collaborators on the project. This idea of imagined future deprivation. She says to us that we're here because our whole generation is in danger of not being able to live the way we have been raised to believe that we should live. And it is because of our older generations that taught us how we were going to live by destroying the planet. When I grow up, I really want to have the life that everyone dreams of, with children and a real family. But I start to think that maybe that won't happen because of what we've done now to the environment. I really love this quote. Like when we talk about world making and collective action, we often think about something that's massively transformative in some way, that a system is overhauled, that the Ayatollah in Iran is toppled, and we have democracy and this type of thing. But in the Norwegian context, all she wants is exactly what her parents want and what she's been led to believe in this way. A nice, as we say in Denmark, the kind of hygge, cozy lifestyle. You have the summer house, you can go, you can raise the kids outside, you have your apartment in the city, this type of lifestyle. So I think the content of this imagination is really nice as a form of world making. It's really a desire for want of world maintenance in some sense. And very briefly, I just want to say a few words before I conclude. On a research project, maybe many of us got involved in various research projects during COVID. I have a very vivid memory of sitting on my couch in Copenhagen when the lockdown was announced, and I was reading papers and newspapers and thinking, oh, this COVID thing might be important. Maybe we should do some research. But anyway, it kept me busy for a very long time. This is a photo. I didn't think when I was writing the field social psychology paper I would be doing all my research in fields, but here I am, blurry, with my collaborator Thomas Morton, and this was actually featured on the cover of the equivalent in Denmark of the BBC or something, this national newspaper. So maybe we looked a bit whimsical, reflecting on the crowd and so on. The reality is that we're waiting for one of our collaborators to bring back 2 beers. So I'm glad he didn't photograph us 2 minutes later. But anyway, we interviewed hundreds of people during the reopening of Danish society, musical and cultural events, when COVID was still a real issue, when people were being infected and so on, but in the context of mass testing and very widespread vaccination in Denmark. So the government really were trying to build this kind of new world, build back better kind of idea. They employed us as cultural, social psychologists to figure out how people were thinking about and feeling about being back in the crowd in this context. We wrote multiple academic papers, they keep coming out all the time, looking at the idea of trust in Danish society, of how it creates the possibility of being together again, how it's kind of shared identity tends to be important. And we asked the question, is it safe for us to be together again? So this is a type of field work, and it's more of an explicit attempt at world making on my part and Thomas Morton as well. It got an awful lot of attention as well, these studies, particularly from an American audience, from the Atlantic and Scientific American. They were looking at what was going on in Denmark as being maybe kind of world leading when it came to reopening society in some way, and what lessons could America learn from what was going on in Denmark. I've seen the future, it's not the life we knew. We were interviewed in the Atlantic magazine about what was going on in Denmark and what America might learn about it. So these are kind of quite explicit attempts at social psychology and our knowledge that we're gleaning to bring to a global audience. Domestically, we wrote many reports for the Danish Ministry of Culture, who had hired us to do this kind of extra work, and was featured in all sorts of Danish newspapers and cultural magazines and so on. And the crescendo was this closed indoor event, a band called the Minds of 99, this big Danish band with 50,000 people. You can see everyone very close together, of course. Again, during the height of COVID, when lots of other places in the world were shut down, and there was no outbreak of COVID-19 from these people being vaccinated. This idea of people who are very trusting that if you were sick or felt sick or tested positive, that you would not come. So this kind of real self-reliance on other people, and it was interesting to document this as well. So I wanted to make one point, but I guess I'm running a little low on time, but just to kind of make one point on world making and maybe where it's going as well. So one issue I'd just like to talk about, maybe irregardless of this slide, is perhaps a neglected role of morality when it comes to world making. You see a lot in the European stage of socio-cultural psychology that people are talking about imagination, how the world is and how it could be. But really what I think is one of the key and important points that's under theorized and under research, and this is a small attempt to do a little research on this, is the role of morality and our views of not how the world is and how it could be, but how the world should be. And I think this is the really big step. And as I advance and I think about advancing the world-making project and this paper and some of the consequences, and if there is a special issue or a handbook gathering or something like this, the idea of morality, I think, tends to be something that's really important, because we have these objective, multiple moral universes, liberals, conservatives in the United States, people in Bhubaneswar in India versus Hyde Park, Chicago, these kind of classic examples of people living in very different moral universes that frames the contours of how they think the world is and ought to be, and how they act and live in a very daily life. So that's kind of my push for what might come next in the social psychology of world making project. But just to conclude with the last slide, my view is that social psychology is not just a historical science, but also a future-orientated science of and for world making. That people are future-orientated and are guided by what could be and should be than what is. Whether we like it or not, and whether it's intended or not, psychology contributes to societies and cultures in which we live. It cannot be a passive bystander in world making. Reconceptualizing social psychology in terms of world making can make it more humble, yet more relevant, connecting it with the pressing issues of our time. Thank you so much.